Let's go ahead and start our lesson with some notes. Sourced ideas, as we've talked about before, they play a big role in making arguments convincing. They're used to lend weight to a writer's arguments and used to place an argument in a broader discussion. However, sourced ideas also play a big role just in how we develop our own ideas on a particular topic. Let's go ahead and pause the lesson at this time to complete that reflection. Reflect on that question you're given. Make sure you write informally and off the top of your head. And let's get back to our notes. Our understanding of the world we live in is primarily developed by our passive observations of things and also our experiences in life. However, this isn't enough to develop complex understandings of things. We can't just rely on what we see passively and experience passively in our lives. We must also actively consume sources of information through reading books, watching television shows and programs and films, consuming news sources, etc. We take what we learn from these outside sources, we run that information through our previous understandings of things, which in themselves are shaped by our values, experiences, our cultural backgrounds, etc. And we use that to produce new understandings of ideas. In language arts, we call this whole process synthesis. Synthesis in the language arts setting is the process of considering various viewpoints in an effort to create a new and more informed position. It should be noted, however, synthesis writing is not necessarily a genre or mode of writing in and of itself. It's not considered to be its own genre or mode. The, quote, synthesis essay really isn't a thing. Synthesis is merely a process, a layer, if you will, that we can add to our argument essays or our expository essays or our narrative essays and so on. So just calling something a synthesis essay really is kind of vague. In AP Lang, for instance, we primarily write synthesis argument essays for the AP Lang exam. However, other times we have to write synthesis expository essays depending on what the prompt is. Some of our study of synthesis in this lesson will be review for you. It'll be things that you've heard before. This particular lesson, however, will focus on 3 areas pertaining to synthesis. We'll start with talking about evaluating sources, then we'll look at properly formatting sources, before finally looking at the different ways you can use sources. Go ahead and pause the lesson again and complete this second reflection. Just reflect on the question you're given. Make sure you write informally and off the top of your head. Now let's resume our notes. Not all sources of ideas are equal. They shouldn't be treated equally. Some sources are just more relevant than others. Some sources are more reliable on particular topics than others. Some sources just offer more convincing ideas than others. It's important that we scrutinize the sources that we read, the sources that we synthesize, by evaluating their credibility. It's also important that we treat the idea of credibility as a relative spectrum, as something that is both relative and a spectrum. Credibility is relative because a source that is highly credible on one topic may not be so on another topic. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. What topics would we say Albert Einstein has credibility on? Well, we definitely say that Albert Einstein, based on his work and his legacy, is a highly credible source on something like theoretical physics or a related field. We wouldn't say he has much credibility if he were to write something about macroeconomics or something not pertaining to the sciences. What about Jeff Bezos? What topics would we say Jeff Bezos has credibility on? Well, Jeff Bezos, being the wealthiest man in the world, having built this massive retail empire in Amazon, we'd say he's highly credible on matters of business and entrepreneurship. However, we'd say he has little credibility on something like politics, which nevertheless he and other billionaires try to insert themselves into. The reason why we study relative credibility is that sources with impressive credentials should not be given automatic credibility on all topics. No, you have to consider where that individual's credibility lies and weigh that against the topic they're actually writing or speaking about. We're naturally prone to just kind of go along with authority figures or those people we admire. Heck, this is why advertisements will often feature spokespeople who have nothing necessarily to do with what they're selling. For instance, Peyton Manning and Brad Paisley are not experts on insurance. However, the Progressive Insurance Agency or whoever, I really don't know what company it is, they use them as spokesmodels because people like those individuals and are naturally to go along with what they say. However, us critical thinkers, we know that what they say in those commercials is clearly just what they're paid to say. They're not actual experts in the field of what makes good or not good insurance. In addition to being relative, credibility is also a spectrum. And it's a spectrum because it exists in varying degrees. Credibility is not binary. We don't just say that something is credible or is not credible. There are varying degrees of credibility. Here is kind of a breakdown of that credibility spectrum, although I should note that this is not an exact science. You cannot apply this perfectly every time. But at the top of the credibility spectrum, if we can say it has a top, at the most credible end, we have credentialed academics, people who have studied a particular field their whole lives, have the academic credentials, meaning degrees, are perhaps employed in the fields by universities or think tanks or something like that. So those credentialed academics in a related field, they're kind of at the end of the spectrum with highest credibility. Right beneath them would be the non-credentialed sort of academics in a field, people like journalists who, while they don't necessarily have as much academic credentials as professors and people with advanced degrees, journalists, their very jobs are to be well researched and to report accurate, in-depth truths about things. And so by the very nature of their jobs, journalists are going to be more credible. However, the more independent the news outlet is, the better. A lot of news outlets today are tied either into corporate interests, like big business interests, big media outlet interests, or to right-wing ideologies, because those naturally support corporate interests. And so the more independent the news outlet, the more credible the journalist is going to be. Beneath them, we have people like nonpartisan government officials or offices or independent officials and offices like people who head up NGOs and that sort of thing. Beneath them, we have non-credentialed individuals who have no selfish interests in the field. So people like bloggers who maybe aren't associated with a news outlet. They're kind of freelance, but they follow this particular field and are credible in that regard, although they don't have the credentials to back it up. Beneath them, we have the more biased sources like partisan government or independent offices and officials, and then non-credentialed individuals who actually have selfish interests in the field, that sort of thing. So that bottom rung would be like, I don't know, a business owner trying to speak about a particular law being considered that would benefit his business or send business his way, that sort of thing. He has a selfish interest in the field and is not necessarily looking at the whole picture, that sort of thing. So generally speaking, that's sort of what you need to think about with the credibility spectrum. Once again, I do need to reiterate that evaluating credibility is not an exact science. You can't just apply that template to everything. You have to use your critical thinking and ask yourself, one, how credentialed is this individual? How widely known are they to be an expert on this subject? And then you have to look at things like their selfish interests. Do they have personal interests that would interfere with their ability to to deliver objective opinions, that sort of thing. Very few sources of ideas can be said to have no credibility at all. Yeah, even sources with little credibility on a topic, they're still capable of writing true and reasonable things, just as sources with high credibility on a topic are capable of writing false and unreasonable things. A source's credibility should merely inform how we treat the source, both what we learn from it, how we learn from it, and also how we reference it in our own writing. So what actually goes into evaluating the credibility of a source? Well, there's three primary elements that you should consider. Consider the authorship of the source, its publication, meaning what publication it was printed in, and then finally the date of publication. When examining a source's authorship, you should consider these two things. First of all, their credentials, just like I've talked about already. What qualifications does this writer have pertaining to the topic at hand? You should also look at any potential bias, meaning what inherent self-interests does the writer have that might color their ideas on the topic. It should be noted at this point that bias does not mean automatically bad or not credible. We shouldn't just ignore biased sources. When working with sources that you've detected clear biases in, you just need to keep the bias in mind as you read their ideas and acknowledge that bias in your writing. When examining a source's publication, you should consider the same things as you considered for authorship. Look for its credentials and any potential biases. Credentials meaning what is the publication known for publishing, and any potential biases like what biases is this publication known to have. Finally, when examining a source's date of publication, you should consider two things. First of all, its age, meaning how long ago the source was published. And finally, its relevance based on that age, as in how much could the information the source gives have changed since that time. But I should mention at this time that just like bias does not necessarily mean a source is bad or not credible or you shouldn't use it, an older source, one that's out of date, doesn't necessarily mean that it's not credible. Yeah, when you're working with older sources, you should keep in mind that age as you read. Think about what might have changed since those ideas were written and acknowledge this. Acknowledge any events or developments since the source was written in your writing. All right, let's go ahead and pause our video for the first exercise today, where it asks you to practice evaluating sources by examining a series of texts, all written on the same topic. Just follow the instructions as printed in your notes. All right, let's go over the exercise, starting with source A. Source A is titled The Top 10 Things You Didn't Know About Wind Power, and it comes to us written by the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. So question 1, who is the writer of the source and what can you infer about their credentials and potential biases pertaining to the topic? Well, the writer of the source would be that U.S. office, that the Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Gosh, it's a long, long name, but that U.S. agency is the writer of this source. What can we infer about their credentials and potential biases? They're on the credibility spectrum. They're going to rank pretty high. These types of agencies are supposed to be kind of largely nonpartisan. I know that that's not necessarily been the case lately, but when we read through the source, I don't see any particularly biased information there. It's just the presentation of a whole lot of facts about wind energy. So I think that credibility-wise, their credentials make them fairly credible, and I don't really see any biases that would be getting in the way. Question 2, what publication is the source published in, and what can you infer about its credentials and potential biases pertaining to the topic? Well, this is published on a U.S. government website, the Department of Energy's website, energy.gov. And as far as we know, that particular publication source doesn't really have any more biases than the office itself. So we can kind of ignore the actual publication, the publisher, if you will, for our purposes of evaluation. Question number 3, when was the source published, and what significant events or developments have occurred since then that might affect how we treat the source's ideas? Well, the source tells us, right up front, that it was published on October 8th, 2020. Wow, that's really recent, just a little over a month ago. So the information there, time-wise, is going to be very reliable. I'm willing to bet not a lot has changed about the production of wind energy in just the last month and a half. So that key makes the source highly credible age-wise. Number 4, does the writer argue a position on the topic or merely relate information about the topic? How so, and how might this affect how we treat the writer's ideas? So this is just kind of a listicle, right? That's what we kind of call these things, these list of top 10 this and that. Those articles usually don't have a particular point of view that they're trying to get across, a particular position that they're trying to argue. And yeah, we can just tell that by based on the title, Things You Didn't Know About Wind Power. It's going to be just sort of fact-based, just kind of delivering information to us and allowing us to take that information and use it for whatever will, just to kind of educate ourselves. So I wouldn't say that the writers argue a particular position about wind power. They merely relate information. And now for the final question, what outside sources does the writer reference in the text, and what aspects of authorship, publication, and or date might affect how we treat those ideas? So we've examined the author of the text. Now we also need to examine kind of the authorship, publication, and date, and evaluate of any outside sources that the writer themselves bring in. So this particular text has some hyperlinked ideas here, which a lot of modern online texts do. It's a really simple way to link to the information or link to the source that you're pulling information from. But if we click on these hyperlinks, they all just take us out to different pages on the Department of Energy's website. So it doesn't cite any outside sources, just cites other things that the Department of Energy has written. So there's no other sources other than the Department of Energy to concern ourselves with. So yeah, there's really no outside sources referenced at all in this text. Okay, moving on to source B. Who's the writer of the source, and what can we infer about their credentials and biases? The writer of this source is a guy named Nate Seltenrich. We're not given really any information about him, but we can infer that he's an academic just based on the kind of paper that he's written here. It is rigorously sourced, and it also appears on what appears to be the website of an academic journal. So credibility-wise, going to be pretty high on the credibility spectrum. Question 2 asks, what publication is it published in? Again, this is an academic journal called Environmental Health Perspectives. So once again, credibility-wise, it's up there as far as on the credibility spectrum. And finally, question 3, when was the source published? This was published January 1st, 2014. Okay, so we've got a much older source than what we dealt with in source A. This is a source that's almost 7 years old now. And so we have to ask ourselves, what has changed between then and now? This text was published in 2014, so a lot of his research is going to be even older than that, because that's just the nature of research. Research takes a long time, research studies take a long time to complete. And so we have to keep in mind what could have changed over the past really decade that we're talking about here as far as wind energy goes. And so, technology keeps improving. The noise from wind turbines has been an ongoing issue for a while. So I think it's safe to say that they haven't gotten more noisy. They've probably gotten less noisy, but we don't really have anything to back that up. So I think it's not really going to affect what we're talking about, because I think that the fact that they make noise is probably just in part of the machine itself and can't really be fixed. So I think this is going to be pretty credible information, even though it is old, because even though it's a lot of it's a decade old, and that's just because research takes a while to collect, and we haven't really known about any great breakthroughs in wind energy technology that has necessarily changed this. Question number 4, does the writer argue a position on the topic? This is very interesting because it sounds like Nate Selton-Rich, at first blush, it sounds like maybe Selton-Rich is saying that wind turbines are dangerous to public health because of the noise they make. But if you read closely, he doesn't ever actually make that statement. Instead, he merely relates a whole lot of research. He starts off by relating some personal anecdotes, then relates a whole bunch of research, and really the only conclusion he draws is that this is an issue, the noise and its effects on the health of people. That is an issue that is being studied, but is also an issue that does not have any concrete a scientific consensus behind it. And so if we say he does take a position, it's a rather weak position. The position being there may be some sort of connection between the noise that wind turbines make and public health. So he's not actually saying that it does. He's just saying that it's being studied and there may be a connection there. Finally, question 5, what about outside sources? So this is an academic text, and it includes tons of academic sources or outside sources, starting with the 2 individuals that he cites in his anecdotes in the very beginning, the 2 residents of this place in, was it Oklahoma? It doesn't really matter where it was. Massachusetts, I'm sorry. And so, those 2 individuals, so think about their credibility. People with personal anecdotes, they have credibility, of course, about their own lives, and we don't have any reason to distrust what they say. However, they're not experts on this issue. They've kind of self-diagnosed their own medical problems. So again, we don't want to discount what they're feeling. I'm sure that these people are feeling the headaches and the dizziness and insomnia and that sort of thing, but they're not doctors. And so all we can really trust from them is that they have these health problems and they have a wind turbine very near their homes. Other things that are other sources, outside sources that he uses here, this ENNAH, the European Network on Noise and Health, which is a big source that he uses in that second section about just environmental noise in general. That's going to be some sort of nonprofit agency, so pretty high up on the credibility spectrum. He also cites the World Health Organization. That's another big kind of international nonprofit organization, which, despite what Donald Trump says, is actually very reputable. Yeah, that's going to be high up on the credibility spectrum. Continuing on, he cites a lot of different other academics and their studies that they've conducted, and he sources all of those with footnotes, and so that's going to be what they have to say is also very credible because he's citing people talking about things in their field that they have studied. So as far as the outside sources go, yeah, he cites a ton of them. He brings in a lot of outside sources of varying degrees of credibility, from the lay people at the very beginning to the more credible academics and experts throughout the rest of his essay. And lastly, we get to source C, Blowin' in the Wind, Texas Ranchers Turn to Turbines, by a guy named Hal Brown. So number 1, who's the writer of the source? Well, I just said it. It was Hal Brown. We don't really know anything about this guy except that he is a contributing writer to this magazine, which is The Environment Magazine. Yeah, it brings us to number 2. What's the publication? Yeah, it's if we look kind of down at the bottom of each page, we'll see that this is called E-Magazine, which stands for The Environment Magazine. Real original there. And so thinking about, we don't know anything about the writer in particular, and so really we can kind of treat the writer and the publication itself as sort of the same sort of, look at those in the same way when evaluating credibility. So this is a magazine. It's clearly not like a commercial magazine though. Yeah, like it's a going to be kind of a nonprofit. You know, I wouldn't call this an academic journal, but it's going to be an you know, a more academic magazine just based on its subject matter, that sort of thing. When was the source published and what significant events or developments might have occurred since then? This was published way back in 2008, so the January, February 2008. So this is the oldest source so far. But again, not a whole heck of a lot has changed with wind turbine technology. It's only improved. Wind turbines have gotten taller. Wind farms have gotten more expansive. But based on what Hal Brown talks about in this text, there's not really a lot that he says or brings up or references that is going to be affected by the age here, because presumably since the wind energy sector is still kind of increasing, these sorts of things, the economic developments that he talks about, will have kept on going. I doubt that the examples he gives would have stopped after 2008. And so the age of the source, yeah, we'd like to have some more newer examples, but these aren't, we shouldn't really discount its credibility based on its age. As far as the publication and the writer, they seem to be pretty credible, especially considering what we're asked to look at in the next question here. In the next question, number 4, does the writer argue a position? Not really. Again, just like Selton Rich, this guy doesn't really argue for or against wind power. He just kind of relates a key concern or a key issue kind of on both sides of that debate, how wind power has helped people economically, but perhaps not as much as continued fossil fuel exploration, that sort of thing. And so I wouldn't really say that he has, again, a strong position on the issue of wind energy. His position is just, hey, here's what wind energy has been able to do for certain rural communities that previously relied on fossil fuels, that sort of thing. And finally, number 5, what outside sources does the writer reference? This one's kind of interesting because he references not a whole lot of experts per se, but a whole lot of people with vested interests in what they're talking about here. So the people that he interviews include a guy named Neil James from Florida Power and Light, who are kind of the owners of these wind farms. And so, yeah, Neil James is definitely going to have a vested interest in his wind farms succeeding. And so we have to kind of keep that bias in mind when we read what he's talking about. Most of what Neil James is quoted as saying, though, is just some basic statistics, and so the bias really doesn't play much into that. He then goes on to cite Alicia Sanchez, who is the head of McCamey, the town in Texas, their economic development office, and she's not really, as an elected official, she has some credibility there just because she was, elected or appointed by elected people. And what she says there about taxes increasing, if she has any kind of bias toward the wind energy sector, it's not really coming through by just relating a basic statistic about tax revenue. So again, acknowledging potential biases, but ultimately I don't think it comes into play there. Later on, I did want to, he quotes a whole bunch of people in this text. I want to get to one in particular, this rancher by the name of Ernest Woodward. He quotes a couple of ranchers here, and both of these ranchers have leased out their land to FPL, to wind energy companies, to have wind turbines installed on them. We need to keep in mind that these ranchers are monetarily benefiting from the wind turbines being on their property. So everything they say in support of wind energy, we've got to kind of take it with a grain of salt because they are unfairly benefiting from it. There's one particular quote in here where one of them talks about how wind turbines don't pose any problem to birds, and he just kind of says that our West Texas birds seem to be able to avoid them just fine. It's like, well, okay, you would say that, wouldn't you, even if there were chopping a bunch of birds up. And so we have to take kind of that there. Also, he's not an expert on bird migration or anything like that. He's just a rancher. So when he says things like that, we got to take that with a grain of salt, because we couldn't really rely on that particular bit of information, because it doesn't come from an expert, and it comes from someone who's biased to say that. Let's get back to our notes. There are three different forms that sourced ideas can take in your writing. We often call these the three different ways you can present synthesized evidence. And you can do that through summary evidence, direct quotation, and paraphrase. Summary evidence is where you condense an entire paragraph, multiple paragraphs, or even entire pages down into just one or two of your own sentences. You use summary evidence to provide context to your more specific pieces of text evidence. And that's because summary evidence is weak by itself. Here's an example of summary evidence. If I looked at source C and I condensed the first 3 or 4 paragraphs down into just this statement, saying, Hal Brown, writing for the Environment magazine, explains that wind energy has brought new sources of revenue to West Texas. That's not very specific. That wouldn't be very good evidence by itself, because it's just not specific enough information. How? In what ways did it provide new sources of revenue? But as far as adding context goes, I can use statements like that, those summary statements from sources, to set up more specific pieces of text evidence, like with a direct quotation or paraphrase. Direct quotation is copying word for word what is stated in a text and surrounding that with quotation marks. Yeah, we use direct quotation to provide specific evidence from a source, and it is strong. It's much stronger than using summary evidence, especially when given appropriate context and well explained. We have to keep in mind that direct quotation does have its drawbacks, because you're literally just copying what another author says. You have to explain that as well in your own words. You can't just expect your audience to know what you want them to get out of the quoted material. So you do have to deal with it in a proper way. Here's an example of using direct quotation. Hal Brown, writing for the Environment magazine, notes that, quote, federal tax credits coupled with a Texas mandate requiring that a percentage of electricity come from green power producers have spurred wind energy development. You'll see I used brackets around the word wind energy there, because in the original quotation it just says have spurred development. And of course it's talking about wind energy, but because I added that in for clarity, I put it in brackets there. Lastly, we have paraphrase evidence. That's where you repeat what is stated in a text, but using different language. Unlike summary, paraphrase evidence is not condensed. Okay, it's a sentence by sentence or phrase by phrase. It's an idea by specific idea recreation of what is said in another source. Paraphrase is also used to provide specific evidence, and it is very strong. That is when the paraphrase is accurate to what the author originally said, and when it's coupled with selective quotation. Here's an example of paraphrased evidence. Hal Brown, writing for the Environment magazine, notes that tax incentives and new state energy laws have driven the creation of new wind farms across West Texas. Yeah, you'll see all I did there is take my direct quotation example, and I pulled out the quotation and just paraphrased the ideas that were originally quoted. When paraphrasing, of course, you can't use the exact same wording or phrasing. You can't just copy it word for word. That would be a direct quotation. And if you didn't use quotation marks, that would be plagiarism. However, there are some instances where you can paraphrase and still use some of the exact same wording. Yeah, you can do this for things that are like numbers and names, words that aren't actual unique intellectual property of the writer who authored them, or for ideas that just don't have synonyms, like proper nouns or concepts that don't really have any other terms to describe them. Those sorts of things don't necessarily have to be quoted, again, unless they're part of a larger quoted phrase, which is fine there. I have some examples of this coming up in a little bit. The best evidence that you can synthesize in your work should use a blend of summary, paraphrase, and direct quotation. You want to summarize what the writer's talking about to give it context, and then quote those words and phrases that are absolutely necessary to making your point, and paraphrase the rest. Paraphrase the rest of those ideas that are just necessary to make your point. Finally, for short essays like the ones we write in this class, you always want to avoid long quotations, okay? You should never have, more than a whole clause quoted, right? Because it's always better to paraphrase those non-essential ideas. Okay, in addition to the three different forms that sourced ideas can take, it's also important to understand how to properly format sourced ideas in your writing. Anytime you bring in outside information, you need to make sure that that information is properly framed, embedded, and cited. Framing evidence means a couple of things. First, leading into your evidence by giving it context, which again would be a good place for some summary of the text, and then following up the evidence by explaining what the writer is referring to if ambiguous, and or by explaining how the evidence pertains to your argument. So it's both a lead in and a follow up. That's why it's called framing, like a picture frame surrounds a picture. You're surrounding your text evidence with both a lead in with context and a follow up of commentary. Yeah, at the end of the day, that follow-up is really, really important. A lot of students forget about it. You never want to let a source just speak for you. Never just leave a source hanging out there to say what you hope it's saying. You have to follow it up with your own commentary. Next, embedding evidence really only applies to direct quotations. And it's necessary because you should be using a blend of paraphrase and direct quotation anyway. So how do you blend those two together? Well, you have to embed all of your direct quotations into complete sentences so that the quoted evidence you provide flows along with your natural prose. Sentences with quotations must adhere to normal English grammar and syntax rules so that if you read the sentence without the quotation marks, like if you just took out the quotation marks, the sentence would still read as a complete sentence that followed normal grammar and syntax rules. And finally, citing evidence. Citing evidence refers to citing specifically where the evidence came from within the text. In a long text, you always want to cite page numbers. In shorter texts, cite paragraph numbers. If you're citing evidence from a poem or any kind of text where you're given line numbers, use those line numbers because they're more precise. On the synthesis essay for AP Lang, you don't need to deal with page numbers, paragraph numbers, or line numbers. You just need to cite the source by its letter. Okay, refer to source A, source B, source C. No need to cite the title of any of your sources. You can just refer to it as source A, source B, source C. Now, you still want to introduce the source by discussing who the author of the source is and briefly give their credentials. But as far as your parenthetical citation or your in-text citations go, you don't need to relate the title of the text. You can just call it source A. So according to Hal Brown in source C, that's just a shorthand way of moving quickly on the synthesis essay since it's timed on the AP Lang exam. So I briefly alluded to this. Whenever you cite evidence, you either want to give your citations within the sentence you're writing or writing about the evidence, or in parentheses at the end of whatever syntactic unit it is that contains the evidence. Note how I say put the parenthetical citation at the end of the syntactic unit that contains the evidence and not at the end of the sentence necessarily. Put it at the end of the sentence if the whole sentence or the ideas immediately previous are the ideas that you're citing. But anytime you have a sentence that contains both cited evidence and your own ideas. For instance, you have like a compound sentence where the first clause is cited from a source and your second clause is your own commentary on it. Anytime you have that, you want to make sure you do parenthetical citation after that first clause. Because if you do it at the end of the sentence, it sounds like the whole sentence is sourced from that particular source instead of the part that you know is sourced and the rest being your ideas. So be very specific. Always put it at the end of the syntactic unit that contains the actual evidence. Here now is an example of evidence synthesized properly, featuring a blend of summary, paraphrase, and direct quotation that is also framed, embedded, and cited. Here we go. Hal Brown, writer for the Environment magazine, explains that wind energy has brought new sources of revenue to West Texas, specifically citing the success story of the town of McCamey, where wind energy has, quote, restored McCamey's economy. Brown notes that, according to the town's head of economic development, McCamey was, quote, dying after a prolonged decline in local oil production. However, the development of area wind farms has since increased tax revenues 30% between 2004 and 2007. That's from source C. While only one example, McCamey's success suggests that investment in wind energy can help revive rural areas decimated by tapped-out oil and gas fields. Okay, so there's one complete sort of synthesized idea from a source. It starts off by identifying the author of the source, briefly giving his credentials or what I know about him writing for this magazine. Continues to frame the text with some context, explaining that wind energy has brought success stories to specifically to this town of McCamey in West Texas. And then I get into my more specific evidence, that blend of paraphrase and direct quotation. And finally, I finish that up with some parenthetical citation, noting in parentheses that it's from source C. And then I finish my framing by elaborating with my commentary here, while only one example, McCamey's success story, suggests this larger thing. So that is a model that you can use to make sure that the text evidence you pulled features that blend of summary, paraphrase, direct quotation, is properly framed, embedded, and cited. Alternately, I just wanted to show you this. Remember I said you can also cite sources just in your sentence. You never want to cite the same source both in your sentence and parenthetically, but feel free to alternate between the two just as it works within your prose. So here, I didn't parenthetically cite source C. I cited in the very beginning, in source C, Hal Brown, writing for the Environment magazine. That works too. All right, time to pause again for our next exercise where you're going to practice properly formatting ideas from another couple of sources by reading another two texts and by practicing framing, embedding, and citing the evidence in them. So there's a lot of different ways that you could have approached these. So I'm just going to give you one as an example. I'm just going to go over what I did for number one, which asked you to explain why, according to source D, camouflaging or shrinking wind turbines are not effective means of countering their impact on natural landscapes. So I'm going to do this sentence by sentence just to show you how I did it, starting with the initial framing. I've got to give context to my specific evidence. This is also a good place to introduce who my author is and what their credentials are. Now, I don't know anything about Troy Rule except that he had a book published, so that's his credibility right there. So I just said, in his 2014 book, Solar, Wind, and Land, Troy Rule explains that hiding wind turbines from view is unfeasible. Okay, so there's my context. I'm explaining what the author's talking about, and so that's some summary evidence there. Next, I bring in my first piece of specific text evidence where I combine paraphrase and direct quotation. He notes that it is, quote, impossible to successfully camouflage turbines with paint, given that the colors surrounding them change throughout the day and across seasons. And now my second specific piece of text evidence, Rule goes on to explain that building wind turbines lower to the ground to make them less visible, quote, is also rarely a viable option, since the amount of energy the turbines produce, quote, tends to increase significantly with altitude. And then at the end, I've got my parenthetical citation, source D, because I didn't identify it as source D earlier. Now I'm going to finish up my framing with some commentary that elaborates on what I want my readers to get out of these pieces of evidence from these sources. It would seem that there is no way to successfully disguise or hide wind farms from view. The very nature of how they work causes them to attract attention. Okay? That's all it takes, just to kind of follow up my evidence with my own ideas so that the text evidence doesn't stand on its own. Okay, let's get back to our notes. As we said before, the most effective arguments will synthesize sources in two ways. One, to lend weight to your ideas, and two, to place your argument within a broader discussion. Remember, when using sources to lend weight to your own ideas, you're looking for different ways that you can use sources to provide support for a claim, demonstrate concurrence with an authority on the topic, offer examples or illustrations of what the heck you're talking about, or to define, explain, or clarify key concepts that you're talking about. When you use sources to place your argument within a broader discussion, that means providing background information on the topic, using sources to provide that background information, bringing in sourced evidence to frame the different sides of an issue, or bringing in sourced evidence to introduce an opposing argument for rebuttal or refutation. And for our first synthesis essay that we're going to write next week, you're actually going to be required to synthesize at least one source for rebuttal and refutation, meaning that you're going to need to synthesize at least one source to act as a counter argument so that you can rebut or refute what that source says. So let's practice that. With our final practice activity, you're going to be looking at another couple of sources pertaining to this topic of wind energy. Read those texts and then practice using them to make a short refutation argument similar to the ones that you've seen in the Heidi Schlumpf essay before Thanksgiving break, as well as the Jake Jamieson essay that we studied before break.